Close your eyes, picture a king, not the majestic monarch of fairy tales, but a figure whose life became a dark, cautionary legend. What happens when a man's ambition swells to such a grotesque size that it consumes everything in its path, including the man himself? When the very power and wealth he so relentlessly pursued turn against him, becoming a black legend whispered for centuries in hushed tones. Prepare yourself for a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about success and its ultimate, terrifying price. On June 26, 1830, the man once celebrated as the first gentleman of England, George IV, met an end so utterly grotesque, so pathetically devoid of dignity, that it repulsed even his most loyal servants. His death wasn't that of a sovereign passing with grace. It was the chilling, complete disintegration of a human being, a stark, cautionary tale about absolute power corrupted beyond recognition by unchecked indulgence. What you are about to read is not merely the chronicle of a reign's end, but the harrowing total collapse of a man, seen through the horrified eyes of those who witnessed the nightmare of George's final days. Born George Augustus Frederick on August 12, 1762, he seemed destined for greatness. The eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte, he inherited every advantage royal birth could bestow: a sharp intellect, an undeniable charm, and a remarkable physical beauty that quickly made him the darling of elegant society. Yet, even in his youth, the subtle, insidious seeds of his eventual self-destruction were already being sown. His father, the austere and deeply religious George III, maintained a rigid, morally upright household that the young prince found utterly suffocating. This repressive atmosphere, designed to foster virtue, instead bred rebellion. By the tender age of 21, George escaped to Carlton House in Pall Mall, London, where he began what would escalate into a lifelong pattern of systematic self-destruction. The contrast with his frugal and disciplined father could not have been more pronounced. While George III embraced moral rectitude, his heir plunged headfirst into excess in every conceivable form. The prince surrounded himself with a coterie of dissolute companions, consumed prodigious quantities of alcohol, and embarked on a series of scandalous affairs that became constant fodder for the era's gleefully satirical press. The 1780s marked a pivotal shift in George's life, transforming him from a promising young prince into something far more sinister and pathetic. His appetite for rich food quickly became legendary. A typical breakfast, for instance, consisted of enough food to feed a small family, and this was merely the prelude to his daily, orgiastic consumption that would continue through elaborate lunches and dinners. These meals often resembled ancient Roman revels more than civilized repasts, showcasing his unbridled gluttony. As his weight skyrocketed, so too did his astronomical debts. By the 1790s, George owed truly staggering sums to London's most esteemed merchants and relentless moneylenders. Parliament, burdened by his financial recklessness, repeatedly bailed him out. However, each rescue merely enabled further, more audacious excess. The prince seemed utterly incapable of learning restraint, viewing money as an inexhaustible resource that existed solely for his immediate gratification. His expenditures on lavish clothing, opulent furniture, priceless art, and extravagant entertainment reached levels that genuinely shocked even the most profligate members of the aristocracy. His personal relationships mirrored this destructive pattern. His illegal marriage to the Catholic widow Maria Fitzherbert in 1785 ignited a constitutional crisis. This was followed by his subsequent disastrous official marriage to Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795, which rapidly devolved into one of the most infamously unhappy royal unions in British history. George was so repulsed by his bride upon their first meeting that he immediately called for brandy, while Caroline famously remarked that he was very fat and not so fine as his portrait. Their wedding night, during which George was discovered unconscious and drunkenly sprawled by the fireplace, chillingly set the tone for a relationship that would scandalize all of Europe. The couple's intense mutual hatred became a constant source of public entertainment, with newspapers and satirical caricaturists gleefully documenting every sordid detail of their bitter separation. George's cruel treatment of Caroline, whom he later attempted to divorce upon becoming king, demonstrated a level of callousness far beyond mere marital discord. He systematically excluded her from court, removed her name from the Book of Common Prayer, and even brazenly attempted to prevent her from attending his own coronation. When Caroline suddenly died in 1821, many suspected that the relentless stress of her husband's persecution had tragically hastened her demise. Throughout these decades of public scandal and personal excess, George's body began to visibly bear the devastating marks of his self-destructive lifestyle. By 1797, at just 35 years old, he weighed a massive 111 kilo, an enormous size for the era. His face, once admired as among the handsomest in England, began to swell and distort, developing a series of chins that no amount of fashionable cravats could possibly conceal. His once athletic physique vanished beneath layers of fat, making even simple movement an increasingly painful struggle. Yet remarkably, the prince's vanity remained undimmed, even as his body visibly deteriorated. He employed an army of skilled tailors, ingenious corset makers, and cosmetic artists, all dedicated to maintaining the crumbling illusion of his former beauty. His corsets became engineering marvels, a bastille of whalebone, as one observer noted, meticulously designed to compress his enormous belly into something resembling a human form. He donned elaborate wigs to hide his thinning hair, applied rouge and powder to disguise his increasingly pallid complexion, and favored ever more extravagant costumes that served as a visual distraction from his physical decay. When George III suffered his final mental collapse in 1810, his eldest son officially became Prince Regent, wielding real royal power while his father languished in madness and isolation. The regency period, lasting until George III's death in 1820, should have marked the apex of the prince's accomplishments. Instead, it accelerated his personal decline and signaled his transformation from a merely dissolute prince into something far more sinister and pathetic. As regent, George possessed unprecedented power to reshape British society to his tastes. He commissioned magnificent architectural projects, patronized the arts on a scale not seen since the Renaissance, and presided over some of the most brilliant social seasons in London's history. However, beneath this glittering veneer of cultural achievement lay a growing darkness that would eventually consume him entirely. His drinking escalated to levels that shocked even his most hard-drinking contemporaries, while his burgeoning addiction to laudanum, liquid opium, began to cloud his mind for days on end. The regent's legendary banquets became grotesque spectacles of consumption that horrified foreign visitors. During one 6-week period in 1816, Carlton House consumed over 2,200 kilos of meat alone, not including other provisions. The prince personally consumed quantities of food that seemed physically impossible for any human to digest, washing them down with rivers of wine, champagne, and spirits that often left him in a stupor for hours. His dinner parties would stretch from early afternoon until dawn, with guests frequently departing in utter horror at the prince's appalling behavior. By 1820, when he finally ascended to the throne as George IV, he had already become a figure of ridicule rather than respect. His coronation, which cost nearly £1 million, an unimaginable sum at the time, was widely criticized as an exercise in megalomaniacal excess. The new king appeared in a crown bedecked with over 12,000 rented diamonds, his massive body squeezed into silver silk robes that made him look, in the cutting words of one observer, a magnificent whale dressed for a masquerade ball. The early years of George's reign were marred by political crises that vividly exposed his fundamental unsuitability for kingship. His infamous attempt to divorce Queen Caroline created a public spectacle that irrevocably turned the British people against him. His blundering interference in governmental policy demonstrated a grasp of statecraft that was both naive and dangerously inept. Parliament, weary of his antics, learned to work around the king rather than with him, effectively reducing him to a mere ceremonial figure whose primary function was to avoid causing further scandal. As the 1820s wore on, George's physical condition deteriorated with terrifying speed. His weight soared past 127 kilos, making him one of the most obese individuals in all of Britain. His legs, grotesquely swollen with fluid retention, became so agonizingly painful that he could barely walk. Stairs became insurmountable, forcing his bewildered servants to carry him through his own palaces like an enormous, breathing piece. The stark contrast between his public image as a king and his private reality as a decrepit invalid created a profound cognitive dissonance that drove him deeper into isolation and drug dependence. The king's laudanum addiction reached truly perilous levels during this period. He regularly consumed over 100 drops before public appearances, a dose potent enough to render most people unconscious. The drug left him in a perpetual stupor, rendering him incapable of focusing on governmental affairs for more than a few fleeting minutes at a time. His speeches devolved into incoherent ramblings that mortified his ministers and delighted his enemies. Foreign diplomats frequently reported that the King of England appeared to be either drunk or heavily drugged during most official functions, a deeply embarrassing state of affairs for the nation. George's eyesight began to fail catastrophically in the late 1820s, adding yet another layer of humiliation to his already pathetic existence. Like his father, he developed severe cataracts that left him nearly blind. He underwent primitive eye surgery in September 1829, but the procedure provided little lasting relief. By December 1828, he could no longer even sign documents, forcing Parliament to create a stamp bearing his signature that could be applied in his presence. The king, who had once prided himself on his beautiful handwriting, could no longer write his own name. Gout, the traditional affliction of the wealthy, attacked George with particular virulence in his final years. His hands and feet became so excruciatingly swollen and painful that the lightest touch could send him into paroxysms of agony. He was forced to wear specially designed slippers that accommodated his grotesquely enlarged feet, while his hands became so profoundly deformed that he could no longer hold a pen or even a fork. The king, who had once been famous for his elegant manners, was reduced to being spoon-fed like a helpless infant by his increasingly disgusted servants. The physical changes in George's appearance during his last years were so dramatic they shocked even those who saw him regularly. Sir David Wilkie, who painted the king's portrait in 1829, reported that George was wasting away alarmingly day by day, despite his immense size. The artist described the experience as a very difficult and melancholy business and cuttingly compared the king to a huge sausage stuffed in its casing. Wilkie's portrait, diplomatically flattering as royal portraits always were, could not entirely conceal the undeniable fact that its subject had ceased to resemble a human being in any recognizable sense. George's breathing became increasingly labored as his massive weight relentlessly compressed his lungs and heart. He could no longer lie down in bed as the pressure on his chest threatened to suffocate him. Instead, he was forced to sleep sitting upright in a specially constructed chair, his head resting in his hand for support, his body propped up by an elaborate system of cushions. Even this position provided little comfort, as his sleep was constantly interrupted by agonizing fits of coughing and choking that left him utterly exhausted and desperately craving more laudanum. The king's skin, once admired for its delicate complexion, became a horror to behold. Layers of fat had stretched it to the breaking point, creating folds and creases that were never properly cleaned, leading to persistent infections and open sores that stubbornly refused to heal. His face, swollen beyond recognition, took on an alarming grayish hue that chillingly suggested internal decay. Servants reported that touching the king's flesh was like squeezing raw dough, soft, yielding, and somehow unwholesome, in a way that made even the most hardened palace staff recoil in disgust. The overwhelming smell of decay emanating from George's body became one of the most frequently mentioned and most repellent aspects of his final years. Despite the tireless efforts of his valet and physicians, his massive form had become impossible to properly keep clean. The combination of infected sores, soiled skin folds, and the potent side effects of his various medications created an odor so overpowering that servants would literally gag upon entering his chambers. Visitors to Windsor Castle reported detecting the king's presence from distant rooms, guided by an aroma that horrifyingly suggested decomposition had already begun. On the night of June 25, 1830, King George IV's condition rapidly deteriorated. His breathing became excruciatingly labored, and his complexion turned a chilling grayish hue, signaling the complete failure of his circulatory system. Though doctors knew death was imminent, the king himself seemed strangely oblivious. He dismissed his primary physician and settled into his chair for what would be his final sleep. In a scene both deeply pathetic and profoundly touching, only Sir William Waller, his ophthalmic surgeon and one of his last loyal companions, remained by his side, holding the hand of the grotesquely obese, dying monarch. This simple, humane gesture underscored the profound tragedy of a life largely devoid of genuine love or friendship. As dawn broke on June 26th, George's body began its final shutdown. Around 3 a.m., he awoke from his restless sleep and experienced a catastrophic crisis, a bloody bowel movement signaling complete digestive system failure. His last coherent act was to cry out for his physician, reportedly screaming, "Sir Henry! Sir Henry! Fetch him! This is death!" His final moments were as undignified as his life, concluding with incoherent groans or perhaps a last bewildered question before he died at 3:15 a.m., his head slumping onto his page's shoulder. The subsequent autopsy revealed the full, shocking extent of his self-inflicted damage. Massive fat deposits crushed his vital organs, rendering normal function impossible. Evidence of a ruptured blood vessel in his stomach confirmed his final crisis, and his liver bore the telltale marks of chronic alcoholism. News of his death spread swiftly through London, but the public reaction was devoid of traditional mourning. Instead, there was barely concealed relief, even outright celebration. The Times published what remains one of the most scathing obituaries for a British monarch, pointedly asking, "What eye wept for him? What heart felt one single throb of disinterested sorrow?" The paper's brutal honesty reflected a widespread sentiment. George IV was not merely a bad king, but a fundamentally repugnant human being whose death was a cause for celebration, not grief. His passing marked the end of a reign defined by excess and left behind a stark reminder of unchecked ambition's ultimate humiliating cost. The death of King George IV was far from a moment of national mourning or royal reverence. Instead, it became a final spectacle, underscoring all the worst aspects of his reign: extravagance, embarrassment, dysfunction, and a deep disconnection from both his people and his own court. His passing was not met with heartfelt tributes or affectionate remembrances, but rather with logistical nightmares, public mockery, and an overwhelming sense of relief. From the moment George breathed his last, problems began. His body, ravaged by years of overindulgence, alcoholism, and neglect, was already showing signs of decomposition even before his death was officially declared. The stench from the corpse was unbearable, and the embalmers, who had seen much in their profession, openly complained about the conditions. The same body once drenched in perfumes and wrapped in the finest fabrics now emitted a stench of decay that no amount of preparation could conceal. Preparing his body for burial was nearly impossible. His massive size ruled out traditional methods. A special coffin had to be commissioned, made from expensive Spanish mahogany and lined with lead to contain his weight and slow the decay. But even this reinforced coffin caused damage. The palace corridors had to be covered in protective wooden panels to prevent destruction from its sheer bulk. It was a grotesque symbol of George's lifestyle: heavy, extravagant, and dysfunctional. The lying in state at Windsor Castle was a mockery of royal solemnity. Although protocol dictated black dress and solemn behavior, the mood was anything but somber. Visitors came not to mourn, but to satisfy morbid curiosity. Some merely wanted to see the oversized coffin with their own eyes. Others simply sought confirmation that George was truly dead. The atmosphere was one of uncomfortable amusement, not grief. Contemporary reports described the funeral as an event filled with scorn and irreverence. Instead of weeping, there were whispered jokes among courtiers. Many guests seemed eager for the ceremony to end. Even George's brother William, soon to become William IV, shocked attendees with his gleeful behavior, showing a lack of decorum that was remarkable even by royal standards. It was clear that the court, and perhaps the nation, simply wanted to move on. The burial itself presented mechanical challenges. George's coffin was so heavy that the royal crypt floor had to be reinforced. Pulleys and braces were installed to safely lower it into place. This engineering feat underscored a cruel irony. Even in death, George's excesses created complications, costs, and inconvenience. What followed was even more damning. No touching tributes were offered by friends, no heartfelt anecdotes shared. No one recalled private kindnesses or redeeming qualities. Instead, the public reaction was one of profound relief. Duke of Wellington, one of the most respected figures in Britain, gave a scathing yet widely agreed upon assessment. "He was the worst man I ever came across in my life. The most selfish, the most false, the most ill-natured, the most entirely without one redeeming quality." His words echoed the thoughts of many who had interacted with George professionally or personally. The accession of William IV brought a collective sigh of relief to the government and the royal household. Although William had his quirks, he was at least functional, a king who could speak, walk, and fulfill his duties, unlike his brother. The comparison between the two made George's failure even more obvious. One had been a helpless invalid, the other simply capable, which felt like a miracle in contrast. Historically, George IV's legacy remains overwhelmingly negative. Though he supported architecture and the arts, including projects like Buckingham Palace, his cultural contributions are overshadowed by personal scandal, gross mismanagement, and national shame. Most historians agree that Britain would have fared better had he never ascended the throne at all. The satirical press, long restrained, exploded in celebration upon his death. Caricatures and vicious cartoons mocked every aspect of his funeral, from the coffin's immense size to the conspicuous absence of sincere mourners. For decades, artists had reined in their criticism due to the king's position. Now that he was gone, they unleashed their fury, producing scathing images and biting commentary that captured the public sentiment perfectly. Even the cost of the funeral became a symbol of George's extravagant and useless reign. The ornate coffin, the reinforced crypt, the lavish ceremony, all of it came at immense cost to the treasury at a time when the country was already burdened by significant debt. It was a fitting conclusion to a life defined by financial irresponsibility and personal indulgence. In the end, the death of George IV was not a royal tragedy, but a cautionary tale. It showed that no amount of wealth or power could compensate for a life of arrogance, selfishness, and detachment. His downfall, as grotesque in death as it had been in life, continues to resonate as a grim reminder of the ultimate cost of unchecked ego and indulgence.